January 17, 1945. Outskirts of Herlisheim, Alsace, France. The morning fog hadn't yet lifted. Frost clung to the scorched wreckage of last night's shelling. Along a frozen embankment, a US Sherman tank lay dead, its engine silenced, its crew crouched behind it, pinned by enemy fire. German infantry, just 300 yards away, watched from a shattered farmhouse. They'd seen the hit. They assumed the tank, like so many others, was finished. A burning hulk in another no-man's land. But then, something strange happened. 2 American soldiers bolted from cover and slid behind the Sherman's hull. One carried a toolbox, the other a coiled cable and a fire extinguisher. Behind them, a .30 cal machine gun rattled from a foxhole, laying down frantic covering fire. The Germans fired back, but hesitated. What were these men doing? 12 minutes. That sets how long it took. 12 minutes between a dead tank and the thunder of its engine roaring back to life. The turret turned. The cannon fired, and the Germans who had been watching, stunned and disbelieving, found themselves scrambling. It wasn't just a repair, it was a battlefield resurrection, and it rattled even the most disciplined men on the German line. The question is, how did it happen? By January 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final and bloodiest phase. Hitler's last major offensive, the Ardennes counteroffensive, known to most as the Battle of the Bulge, had just been broken. American and British forces had stopped the German push at great cost. The enemy had gambled, thrown their armor into the snow-covered forests of Belgium and failed. Now the Allies were regrouping, and they were moving east again, through Belgium, into Luxembourg, and down into northeastern France. Their goal was clear: breach the Rhine, enter Germany, and end the war. But this part of France was different. The region of Alsace wasn't open country. It was a patchwork of towns, woods, and farmlands threaded with canals and rivers. It had changed hands between France and Germany more than once in the past 100 years. The Germans considered it theirs, and they fought like it. The fighting around Strasbourg and Herlisheim in January 1945 was some of the fiercest of the winter. The US 7th Army, supported by elements of the 12th Armored Division, was trying to clear German units from the area before a full Allied push toward the Rhine. But the Germans had no intention of yielding. In Herlisheim, the US Army encountered dug-in veterans of the 10th SS Panzer Division and regular Wehrmacht infantry. These were not broken remnants. They were trained, coordinated, and equipped with the weapons that had defined German battlefield superiority for much of the war, especially in anti-tank warfare. And tanks were essential here. In the freezing landscape of Alsace, where roads were muddy and visibility poor, American forces relied heavily on armor to lead assaults, break defensive lines, and respond quickly to German counterattacks. The tank, particularly the M4 Sherman, was the tip of the spear. But the spear could break. The Sherman was reliable, fast, and mass-produced. It was the workhorse of American armored divisions, but in battles like Herlisheim, its vulnerabilities were brutally exposed. German 88mm guns could tear through a Sherman's frontal armor before it even got into range. Portable weapons like the Panzerfaust gave German infantry the ability to knock out tanks from alleyways or hedgerows. A single hit could take out the treads, rupture fuel lines, or spark an engine fire. And in these dense villages, a disabled tank became a coffin. Tank recovery units existed, massive armored recovery vehicles known as ARVs, but they were rarely available during combat. The front lines moved fast. The danger was constant, so tank crews were trained to fend for themselves. By late 1944, it had become common practice to carry welding kits, extra spark plugs, track pins, tow cables, jacks, and spare radio components. They were gunners and drivers, but also grease-stained mechanics. It wasn't optional. If your tank broke down, you fixed it, or you died. At Herlisheim, this doctrine was put to the ultimate test. On January 17th, as fog rolled over the frosted fields northeast of the village, one Sherman from the 43rd Tank Battalion was hit. The blast tore into its right track and cracked part of its engine housing. Smoke billowed. The crew bailed out and took cover behind a nearby ditch. German fire intensified. Infantry probed forward. To the enemy, it was another kill. One more burning shell on the road to Strasbourg. But the tank wasn't destroyed, and its crew wasn't done. Instead of retreating, they made a decision, a dangerous, desperate, and brilliant one. They crawled back to the wreck. One man carried a toolbox. Another had a length of steel cable and a fire extinguisher. A third dragged a jerry can. Behind them, American infantry laid down suppressing fire to buy them time. Every second mattered. Shells exploded nearby. Bullets snapped overhead. 12 minutes later, the engine roared. The tank reversed, rotated, and fired. Its gunner found targets. Its crew regained control. German soldiers, caught in the open, scrambled for cover. That moment, that astonishing 12-minute repair, wasn't luck. It was born from the doctrine of battlefield self-reliance, forged in the brutal lessons of Normandy, Holland, and now, Alsace. And it was just beginning to show what made the American soldier in 1945 different from the one who had landed in 1942. The unit involved was the 43rd Tank Battalion, part of Combat Command A, under the 12th Armored Division, nicknamed the Hellcats. Formed and trained in the United States, the 12th had landed in France in November 1944. They were relatively new to combat, but the war wouldn't give them time to adjust. Within weeks, they were thrown into the savage winter fighting of the Ardennes and then diverted south to stem German pressure in Alsace. By mid-January 1945, the 12th Armored was facing its trial by fire. Herlesheim became a death trap. Narrow roads, waterlogged fields, hidden anti-tank guns, all played into German hands. The town itself had been fortified with machine gun nests, minefields, and house-to-house kill zones. Tanks struggled to maneuver. Visibility was poor, and temperatures regularly dropped below freezing, turning mud to ice and steel to brittle. The 43rd Tank Battalion moved in on January 16th. Their objective was to push north of Herlesheim and relieve pressure on American infantry holding the southern edge. But German resistance was immediate. Shermans were hit one after another. Some burned. Some sat crippled, blocking others behind them. The battalion's radio traffic became chaotic. Officers were cut off. Orders were incomplete. It was armored warfare at its most brutal, close-range, personal, and often suicidal. What made it worse was how little room there was for error. Tank warfare required synchronization. Infantry had to cover the flanks. Engineers had to clear mines. Artillery had to be available for suppression. But in Alsace, units were under strength, exhausted, and scattered. So tanks often went in alone or in underpowered platoons. If one was hit, the others had to decide, stop to assist and risk being targeted, or keep moving and leave a crew behind. American doctrine had evolved fast since the early days of Tunisia and Normandy. In 1942, U.S. armor relied heavily on centralized command and structured formations. But experience, particularly against the agile, ruthless German tank and infantry tactics, forced change. By 1944, American tank crews were expected to show initiative, solve problems on the spot, and adapt without waiting for orders. That meant knowing their vehicles intimately. It also meant being able to repair under pressure, to recognize a broken distributor cap or jammed traverse motor and fix it while the shells were falling. Each Sherman carried a basic repair loadout. This included spare road wheels, track pins, a tow cable, and critical engine parts like spark plugs and fan belts. Crews were trained in quick diagnosis techniques, identifying fuel line ruptures, replacing track segments, restarting flooded engines, or resetting jammed turrets. The training wasn't theoretical, it was drilled, practiced under field conditions, often blindfolded or under timed pressure. Still, there was a limit to what could be fixed in combat. That's why what happened near Herlesheim stood out. On the morning of January 17th, a Sherman tank from the 43rd advanced with a column across an open field east of the village. German fire was immediate. Anti-tank shells slammed into the column from a hidden 75 mm pack gun. One Sherman took a hit that broke its right side track and blew off part of the engine cover. Flames flickered at the rear deck. The crew bailed out and crawled into a nearby irrigation ditch. To any observer, American or German, the tank was finished. But inside that crew, a decision was forming. Corporal James R. Kane, the tank's assistant driver, was also the designated mechanic. He knew the tank still had fuel. He knew the fire hadn't reached the engine, and most of all, he knew they were being watched. German infantry occupied a farmhouse just beyond the field. Through field glasses, they saw the crew abandon the Sherman. They likely assumed they would withdraw, wait for darkness, or hope for a recovery vehicle. What they didn't expect was a repair attempt, not under direct fire, not in daylight, and not within sight. But the crew had other ideas. Using smoke from nearby mortar fire as cover, Kane and two others returned to the tank. One kept watch with a carbine, the other popped open the engine compartment. Kane went to work. They had no radio, no support, just what they had brought: a toolbox, a roll of track pins, a sledgehammer, and their training. German observers saw movement. Some thought it was a recovery crew. Others thought it was foolish bravado. What they didn't see was the beginning of a 12-minute window that would shift the fight, humiliate a confident enemy, and burn into the memory of every man who witnessed it. When a tank goes down under fire, training collides with instinct. Some freeze, others run. But among well-trained crews, something else kicks in: calculation. They don't just ask, "Are we alive?" They ask, "Can we get it running again?" The men of this Sherman weren't heroes in the cinematic sense. They were cold, tired, and had already watched comrades die, but they had something drilled into them since Fort Knox. A disabled tank isn't always a dead tank, and if it's not dead, it must be brought back. Corporal Kane wasn't just a mechanic, he was also the loader, responsible for feeding shells into the gun, sweating under pressure. But he knew his engine compartment, like a surgeon knew a chest cavity. Every cable, every fluid line, every bolt had been rehearsed. Fixing a tank wasn't bravery, it was necessity. Private First Class Lowell White, the driver, had a gash across his brow from the earlier impact. He stayed behind the controls, blood dripping into his collar, ready to turn the engine the second Kane gave the signal. Meanwhile, Sergeant Elmer Wright, the commander, manned a carbine outside, firing potshots at muzzle flashes in the distance, buying seconds. They spoke little. There wasn't set time. Just breathing felt like inhaling razors. The January air tore through their gloves. Wrenches slipped, grease froze. But they kept going. They weren't trying to make history. They were trying to survive. The hit from the German Pak-40 had been precise. Not catastrophic, but effective. It clipped the right side track and cracked open the engine cover. Flames erupted briefly, but the fuel tanks were untouched. Most importantly, the main drivetrain was intact. Kane assessed the situation in seconds. The track had thrown. Several guide teeth were sheared off. One return roller had been blasted clean off. The rear idler was crooked. On most days, this meant hours of work. But Kane wasn't looking for perfection. He needed function, just enough to move and shoot. From the toolbox, he pulled track pins, a hammer, and a pry bar. Working from the rear, he began reseating the track. Lowell rocked the hull with the engine off to allow repositioning. Using frozen fingers and brute force, Kane looped the track around the sprocket. 2 pins jammed. He beat them in with the butt of a wrench. Next came the fuel line, partially severed. He bypassed it using a field clamp and a spare hose. He didn't check the seal. There was no time. The coolant level was low. He poured water from a canteen into the expansion tank and hoped it wouldn't freeze solid. Electrical connections were the final gamble. The main battery feed had jolted loose. Kane reconnected the terminals, sparked them together briefly, and signaled White. White turned the ignition. Once, twice. Nothing. A third time, the engine choked, sputtered, then roared. They were mobile. They were alive. The tank could move barely, and the turret traverse was back online. 12 minutes. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't safe. But it worked. From their position in the farmhouse, a German infantry group, possibly from the 25th Panzergrenadier Regiment, watched the Sherman fall silent. Through binoculars, they saw the hatch open, crew members spilled out and vanished into a nearby ditch. The standard procedure. They had seen it before. One less tank to worry about. In German doctrine, knocking out a tank was only half the job. Infantry were trained to finish off crews or force them into surrender. But at Herlesheim, every exposed movement drew return fire from American riflemen. So the Germans waited. Minutes passed. The tank remained motionless. Then they noticed something strange. Movement near the hull, not retreating figures, but returning ones. One man carried tools, another carried a hose. A third moved with purpose, not fear. At first, the Germans assumed it was an armored recovery attempt, suicidal under current fire. Some even speculated it might be a decoy maneuver to draw fire away from another position. What they didn't expect was a genuine repair, mid-battle without support, under their watch. When the tank's engine roared back to life, it stunned them. One soldier dropped his field glasses, another swore aloud. The Sherman began to turn, its turret aligning toward the farmhouse. The Germans weren't cowards, but war favors those who adapt faster, and in that moment the American tank crew had done something the enemy hadn't planned for. They had refused to stay down. It broke the rhythm of the German defense. For the first time that day, they hesitated. In the fog of war, leadership often doesn't come from rank. It comes from instinct, speed, and sheer presence under pressure. On January 17, 1945, there was no direct order to repair the tank, no radioed instruction from battalion, no senior officer barking commands. The decision came from inside the turret. Sergeant Elmer Wright, the tank commander, had minutes, maybe seconds to act. His crew had survived the hit. They were alive but exposed. The tank was dead weight, and German infantry was maneuvering to flank. Staying put meant capture or death. Running meant leaving the tank, and the tactical edge it offered. He looked at Kane and White. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Every man knew what had to be done. This kind of decision-making was exactly what American combat doctrine had evolved toward. After early failures in North Africa, where junior leaders hesitated or waited for guidance, the Army had rebuilt its structure around trust in the NCO, the non-commissioned officer. Men like Wright were trained to assess, decide, and lead, even if it meant breaking the rulebook. So Wright covered the field with his carbine, while Kane and White risked their lives with a wrench and steel cable. They weren't set following orders. They were fulfilling them before they were even given. Every battle has a rhythm. Moments of chaos, then quiet, victories and losses forming a pattern that soldiers begin to recognize. Herlesheim had developed such a rhythm by the third week of January. The Americans advanced. The Germans struck. A tank was hit. The crew bailed out. The Germans logged another kill. This rhythm created confidence for the Germans and resignation for the Americans. Until this moment, when the Sherman reanimated, its engine howling, turret turning, that pattern cracked, not just tactically, but psychologically. German troops who had mentally checked off that tank as destroyed were forced to re-engage. Doubt set in. If that crew could pull off a repair under direct fire, what else were the Americans willing to try? For the Americans, especially the infantry pinned nearby, it was the opposite. Watching one of their own tanks come back to life in real time boosted morale in ways no speech or supply drop ever could. Men cheered behind frozen hedgerows. One lieutenant later wrote in his report, "It was like seeing a corpse sit up and start shooting." Fear shifted. The Germans saw madness. The Americans saw determination. The battlefield, for a moment, tilted. This wasn't just a lucky break or a one-in-a-million moment. It was also the result of a logistical doctrine that prioritized rapid movement, self-sufficiency, and modular repair. The American military machine in World War II was not elegant. It was vast, rugged, and brutally practical. Shermans weren't designed to outgun Panthers. They were designed to be fixable, fast. Components were standardized. Tracks, engines, gearboxes, all interchangeable across variants. A part from one Sherman could be used on another. Crews were trained to exploit this. Each tank carried a basic repair kit: pry bars, socket wrenches, jack stands, grease guns, electrical wire, and spare bolts. Maintenance drills were part of daily routines. Every crew member had at least a basic understanding of every major system: drivetrain, suspension, ignition, and turret rotation. More importantly, the supply chain behind them worked. Even in the chaos of Alsace, fuel, tools, and spare parts were available in the rear. When tanks moved, logistics followed. Fuel trucks, ammo haulers, and mobile repair depots crawled behind the front line like a steel bloodstream. The 12th Armored Division's support elements had already made multiple runs into contested zones that week, reinforcing the idea that tanks weren't disposable, they were recoverable assets. This approach contrasted sharply with German doctrine, which leaned on quality and complexity. German tanks were superior in raw combat capability, but often required specialized parts and mechanics. A knocked-out Panther could be difficult to recover or repair without a full workshop. For the Wehrmacht, a tank lost was often truly lost. But for the Americans, a tank was only dead when every option had been tried, and even then, one more. That 12-minute repair at Hellesheim wasn't just about courage, it was about design, about doctrine, about building a war machine where ordinary soldiers could do the extraordinary because the system let them. It was gritty, improvised, and dangerously exposed. And it worked. The clock starts the moment they moved. Kane was first, his boots crunching over frozen soil as he sprinted the short distance from the ditch back to the Sherman. He kept low, crawling the last few feet. White followed with a hose in one hand, pistol in the other. Behind them, Sergeant Wright raised his head just high enough to sight German muzzle flashes in the distance. He pulled the trigger, 2, 3 shots, then ducked again. The sound of the .30 Cal from a nearby foxhole barked in bursts, providing cover they knew couldn't last. The tank sat awkwardly on its disabled right track. Smoke still curled from its rear hull. It wasn't burning anymore, but heat shimmered from the engine deck. Kane yanked open the rear hatch, not knowing if it would explode in his face. It didn't. He looked inside. The damage wasn't set as bad as it could have been. The track had sheared, coiling around the drive sprocket like a steel noose. A return roller was gone. The rear idler was cracked, but holding, inside the engine compartment, a fuel line had ruptured, and the battery cable had been jolted loose, maybe saving them from a full ignition. Kane shouted over the chaos, "Give me the clamp." White tossed the hose over, nearly losing it to a gust of wind. Kane grabbed the field clamp, sealed the fuel line, and twisted the hose into place. It wasn't tight, but it held. He pulled a jug of water from his pack and dumped it into the radiator. It hissed instantly, steam rising in sharp white jets. The engine was thirsty and half frozen. There was no time to wait. Minutes passed. Shells landed nearby, the ground trembling beneath them. One round struck 30 yards short, spitting dirt and snow into the air like a geyser. They didn't flinch. Next, the track. Kane crawled under the right side of the tank, fingers black with grease, prying the treads straight. The brake had coiled the end under itself, but Kane hammered at it with a frozen wrench, driving a new pin into place. The alignment was bad. He didn't care. They just needed 5 feet of traction. The rest could drag. Inside, White climbed back into the driver's seat. Blood still dripped from his temple. He checked the throttle, toggled the ignition, and watched for the signal. Kane banged twice on the hull. Now. White turned the key. Nothing. Another shell hit, closer this time. Kane rechecked the battery cable. He twisted the terminals together again, bare-handed, skin peeling. Sparks flew. The smell of burning oil returned. White tried again. The engine coughed, turned, and roared. They were back. In the ditch, Wright stood and screamed into the wind. Go, go. White reversed the Sherman out of its sunken position, treads grinding over snow and earth. The right side clanked with each revolution, the track misaligned but holding. The turret swung toward the farmhouse where the Germans had watched in disbelief. Inside, Corporal Judd, the gunner, who'd remained behind to cover them, took his position again. The optics were fogged. He didn't wait. He had the coordinates locked from before the tank was hit. His hands found the traverse wheel. The German farmhouse came into view. He squeezed the trigger. The cannon boomed. A plume of fire shot from the barrel, echoing across the field. The shell slammed into the second floor of the farmhouse, blowing out a window and sending debris into the frozen air. German troops scattered, some diving for cover, others disappearing into trenches behind the building. The tank wasn't moving fast, but it was moving. And it was shooting. The impact on the battlefield was immediate. American riflemen who had been pinned began to rise. One sergeant radioed back, "The tank SEP's alive. I repeat, the tank is alive, and firing." Morale surged. More rounds followed. The Sherman's .50 caliber joined in, rattling off bursts at fleeing silhouettes. The engine groaned but didn't fail. White kept it steady. Kane now manned the hull gun. Judd fired again and again. To the Germans, it was like watching a dead man rise. One Wehrmacht soldier, in a report later recovered from the 10th SS Panzer Division, simply wrote, "They refused to die. That tank came back from the grave." 12 minutes. That's what it took. From the moment Kane touched the hull to the moment the gun fired, just 12 minutes had passed. But in those 12 minutes, the course of the skirmish shifted. A crew SIP's refusal to abandon their tank became a rallying point, and a simple, brutal truth reasserted itself. Sometimes the difference between defeat and defiance is the man who stays behind with a wrench. The roar of the Sherman's main gun echoed over the fields of Herlisheim like a challenge. German positions that had been methodically chewing into American lines were now under direct fire from a tank they had already counted as dead. The psychological advantage which had rested with the Germans since sunrise began to shift. Within minutes of rejoining the fight, the resurrected Sherman became the centerpiece of a renewed American push. Infantry units who had been pinned along the hedgerow began advancing. The covering fire from the tank's coaxial and hull-mounted .30 calibers forced German riflemen into retreat. A platoon of American riflemen moved up the right flank, using the tank as rolling cover. On the German side, the reaction was fractured. The initial confusion turned to frustration. Reports came in over field radios of a tank, thought to be neutralized, now leading a counterattack. Orders were given to re-engage it, to finish what had been started. But there was a problem. Most of the anti-tank weaponry in that immediate sector had already been repositioned, redirected toward other targets assumed to be more pressing. The Sherman, now back online, became untouchable in that moment, not because it was invincible, but because it had already been erased from the Germans' tactical map. It had slipped the logic of the battlefield. That single gap in reaction time gave the Americans an opening. From the east, another tank platoon from the 43rd Battalion arrived, following the sounds of renewed fire. They hadn't expected to see one of their own already re-engaged. Radio chatter buzzed with disbelief. "Is that Red Dog 6? He was down." Another voice replied, "He SEP's not down now." With two Shermans now active, the Americans launched a focused assault toward the farmhouse and adjacent trench line where German resistance had held firm for days. The combination of direct tank fire, flanking rifle squads, and heavy machine gun support forced the German line to bend, then break. The farmhouse, which had been a forward observation post for the 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, was abandoned. American soldiers found maps, destroyed radios, and hastily scrawled notes on the floors. One read simply, "Infantry zurück, Panzer verloren, infantry pulling back, armor lost." By late afternoon, The fields east of Herlisheim were in American hands, but the battle wasn't set without cost. 2 other Shermans were hit in the broader engagement. 1 crew was lost entirely. Another vehicle burned for hours, its ammunition cooking off in dull, rhythmic bursts. For the 43rd Tank Battalion, Herlisheim remained one of the most punishing days of their war. Dozens of men died. The town itself would take another week to fully secure. Still, something had shifted. In war, the scale of victory isn't always measured by territory. Sometimes it's measured by resilience. That 12-minute repair didn't win the war. It didn't even win the day on its own. But it flipped a moment. It broke an assumption. It turned a narrative. For the German soldiers who witnessed it, the incident became a cautionary tale. American tank crews, once mocked for their Tommy Cookers and so-called inferior machines, had now shown an uncanny ability to adapt under pressure. Not with better steel, but with faster hands, deeper training, and relentless refusal to give up ground. Post-action reports from the German command noted the unusual persistence of the American armor units. One lieutenant from the 10th SS, whose unit had held the eastern approach to Herlisheim, wrote in his journal, "They are no longer the same as in Normandy. They repair what we destroy. They return when we expect them to die." The Allies picked up on the event as well. The story of the repair, though not immediately publicized, was recorded in the 12th Armored's after-action reports. Commanders mentioned the crew by name. Medals would follow. The tank itself, later nicknamed Phoenix by nearby infantry, survived the war. It was recovered, patched, and continued to fight through March 1945. For the crew, it wasn't about medals or recognition. When interviewed after the war, Kane would simply say, "We weren't set brave. We were scared of dying, scared of letting the guys next to us down. So we fixed what we could and got back in. 12 minutes. That's all it took to change the temperature of a battlefield, from hopeless retreat to defiant advance. It was instead a miracle. It was maintenance, courage, and clarity under fire. In the language of war, it was a message. And the message was clear. We stir not done yet. When the sun finally dipped below the shattered tree line of Herlisheim on January 17, 1945, the field was quiet again. The smoke, the thunder of guns, and the shouted orders had faded into the icy dusk. But the damage was everywhere. The Americans held the field. Barely. The 43rd Tank Battalion had lost 5 Shermans that day. 2 were recoverable. 3 were not. Casualties across the unit included more than a dozen killed and several dozen wounded. Some bodies wouldn't be recovered until days later, when the area was cleared of mines and sniper fire. For the men still standing, survival felt like a temporary condition. But in the final tallies, one detail stood out, one line in the after-action report that no one overlooked. Sherman Hash, 423 Red Dog, 6 repaired under fire by crew and re-engaged enemy after 12-minute field restoration. Direct fire support enabled infantry flanking maneuver, German withdrawal observed from Sector 3B. In dry military prose, that sentence captured the extraordinary. Word of the incident circulated quickly within the 12th Armored Division. It wasn't announced over loudspeakers or turned into official propaganda, but it became something more powerful, a whispered story between units. A morale booster passed along by men who were there, and wanted others to know that it was possible, that you could win a fight, even after being hit. The tank crew of Red Dog 6, Sergeant Elmer Wright, Corporal James Kane, PFC Lowell White, Gunner Stanley Judd, and radio operator Fred Mitch Mitchell, became minor legends within the division. Kane, in particular, was singled out in a citation for exceptional bravery in technical field recovery under direct fire. He would later receive the Bronze Star, though he rarely spoke about it. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Cohen, made mention of the repair in his weekly operations summary. "The ability of our men to adapt under fire remains our strongest asset. The actions of Red Dog 6 demonstrate that battlefield initiative can overcome superior enemy positioning." Herlisheim remained contested for another week. The town changed hands twice more before finally being secured by the Americans at the end of January. German resistance in the Alsace region continued into early February, but the pressure was broken. Allied forces pushed forward, eventually reaching the Rhine and breaching into Germany proper. In larger strategic terms, the tank repair didn't alter the campaign's outcome, but in tactical terms, in those muddy, brutal, freezing days of January 1945, it meant everything to the men who lived through it. Military historians later pointed to the incident as a crystallizing example of what made the American war machine so effective late in the war. Not just the hardware, not just the numbers, but the flexibility, the empowerment of junior leaders, the expectation that a soldier wasn't just a cog in the system, but the one who could rebuild the system when it broke. And it wasn't such just remembered by the Americans. Captured German documents from the area reflected genuine frustration at the resilience of American armor. One translated officer Strutt report read, "They do not fall back when disabled. They do not wait for darkness to repair. They have tools in their hands before we have reloaded." In the cold logic of war, that kind of unpredictability becomes a weapon. The field, where Red Dog 6 came back to life, remained scarred for months. Cratered earth, a burned-out half-track, rusted helmets half buried in snow. But the tank itself, welded back into fighting shape, rolled on. It would see action again in March, near Worms, Germany, before being rotated back to division headquarters for refit. Red Dog 6 never stopped moving after that day. And neither did the men who fixed it. The incident at Herlesheim didn't just echo through the ranks of the 12th Armored Division. It rippled upward into training manuals, tactical bulletins, and command briefings. Within weeks, staff officers were citing the event in conversations about battlefield mobility and frontline autonomy. The message was simple: tanks are more than machines. They are opportunities, if your men know how to use them beyond firing. By February 1945, the U.S. Army was reviewing its armored recovery doctrine. Reports from Combat Command A included recommendations to expand on-the-spot repair training, increase the spare parts load carried by armored units, and enhance collaboration between tank crews and frontline engineers. These weren't dramatic changes, but they represented a shift in mindset from centralized support to empowered self-sufficiency. Herlesheim's lesson was clear: no one was coming to save you. You had to fix it yourself, under fire, in the snow, with whatever you had. The crew of Red Dog 6, unknowingly, had become the ideal case study. After the war, military publications referenced the event in broader analyses of American flexibility. One Army quarterly review titled "Improvisation in Combat Operations" used the tank repair to argue that battlefield initiative had saved more lives than firepower alone. Another report, circulated within the newly forming armor school at Fort Knox, listed Red Dog 6 as a model of combat serviceability, a term coined to describe how crews could extend operational capability through grit, skill, and immediate action. Even outside military circles, the story began to surface. A short article in Stars and Stripes appeared in March 1945, titled "Tank Crew Fixes, Fights, Wins," with only a few names and no location. But for those in the know, it was enough. The repair had become legend, not exaggerated, not dramatized, just remembered. In Germany, post-war debriefs with Wehrmacht officers consistently noted how the Americans had changed since 1942. Early U.S. operations had been marked by rigidity, formations waiting for orders, machines abandoned after damage, officers hesitant to adjust. But by 1945, that hesitation had been replaced by relentless improvisation. A German panzer commander captured near Heilbronn in April 1945 said, during interrogation, "Their tanks do not stop moving. Even when broken, they are back again. It is as if their soldiers carry workshops in their pockets." The deeper truth wasn't mechanical, it was cultural. The U.S. Army had cultivated a fighting force that didn't wait to be told what to do. It trained soldiers not just to operate weapons but to solve problems, in real time, with incomplete information under fire. The story of Red Dog 6 wasn't unique because it was miraculous. It was unique because it proved what was possible when that culture was fully alive in a crew. Years later, Kane would speak once, and only once, about the repair. In a taped interview for the Army's oral history program, he shrugged when asked how it felt. "I knew what tools I had. I knew what was broken, and I knew what happened if we didn't get it running. It wasn't about bravery. It was about doing your job fast enough not to die." That mindset, stripped of drama, grounded in reality, was what separated surviving units from destroyed ones in those final months of the war. Red Dog 6 kept fighting until March. After the war, it was returned to the US and scrapped during the post-war drawdown. No museum display, no plaque. But in Fort Knox classrooms, in dusty battalion archives, in the minds of mechanics and commanders, the story lived on. 12 minutes. That's all it was. 12 minutes between fire and counterfire, between silence and thunder, between one more destroyed tank and a machine that refused to stay dead. War is often told in the language of strategy, of divisions moved, battles won, cities captured, but beneath every headline and arrow on a map are moments like this one, 12 minutes of quiet desperation in a frozen field. No generals were present, no orders were given, no glory was promised. Just 5 men, 1 broken tank, and a choice. They could have waited, played dead, cursed their luck. Instead, they acted, not because they were fearless, but because they refused to leave their machine, their fight, and each other behind. That choice, made in the chaos of Hellesheim, echoed louder than any victory parade. It told a story of what kind of soldier wins a war, not always the strongest or the fastest or the best equipped, but the one who knows how to bend steel back into shape with frozen fingers while shells fall around him. The one who knows that even if the odds say no, there's still a chance, if you move now, if you try. Red Dog 6 was just one tank among thousands. Hellesheim was just one battle among hundreds. And yet, in that sliver of time, something larger took shape, a testament to grit, training, and the will to adapt. These are the kinds of stories war rarely pauses to honor, but they are the threads that hold victory together. The moments where defeat is postponed, where courage isn't loud, but competent, fast, intentional. That tank didn't come back to life because of fate or luck. It came back because someone refused to give up on it. And because of that, men who might have died, lived. The war moved forward. But history doesn't forget the details. Sometimes it takes just 12 minutes to prove what kind of soldier you are. And sometimes, 12 minutes is all it takes to change everything.